Close your eyes and picture the moment when everything changed, when power shifted in the heavens and the old order was shattered forever. In the dust-choked ruins of ancient Babylon, beneath layers of sand and broken brick, archaeologists unearthed something extraordinary. 7 clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped symbols, a story older than the Bible, a tale of cosmic war, divine ambition, and the rise of a god who would absorb the powers of all others. His name was Marduk. And this is not just the story of how he became king of the gods. This is the story of how an entire religious system was rewritten, how political power shaped divine mythology, how a local farming deity became the supreme architect of reality itself. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. You stand at the threshold of history itself. The air is thick with the scent of mud brick and bitumen, of incense smoke and ancient secrets. You're about to witness the rise of a god, but also something far more profound, the transformation of an entire civilization's understanding of the cosmos. The year is approximately 1100 BCE. But to understand what is about to unfold, you must first travel backward, into the mists of the 3rd millennium, to a time when Marduk was nothing more than a whisper, a minor deity in a crowded pantheon of far more powerful gods. The journey begins not in Babylon, but in the older Sumerian cities that dotted the landscape of southern Mesopotamia, like jewels scattered across a vast alluvial plain. This is the land between 2 rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, where human civilization itself first learned to read and write, to build cities and organize complex societies. Here, in places with names that echo across the millennia, Uruk-Ur, Nippur, Eridu, the Sumerians established the first true urban centers on Earth. And with these cities came gods. Hundreds of them, thousands perhaps. Each city had its patron deity. Each profession, each natural force, each abstract concept had its divine representative. The Sumerian pantheon was a vast bureaucracy of the supernatural, a cosmic civil service with hierarchies, rivalries, and endless political maneuvering. At the pinnacle of this divine hierarchy stood 3 supreme gods. Anu, the distant sky god, the ultimate patriarch who resided in the highest heaven and rarely concerned himself with earthly affairs. Enlil, the lord of wind and air, the chief executive of the pantheon, whose temple at Nippur made that city the religious heart of all Mesopotamia. And Ea, known also as Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water and magic, the clever craftsman who resided in the Abzu, the subterranean ocean of pure water, that was thought to lie beneath the earth. These were the powers that shaped reality. These were the names that mattered, and Marduk was not among them. If you had asked a Sumerian priest in 2500 BCE about Marduk, you might have received a blank stare, or perhaps a dismissive shrug. The name existed, yes, buried in obscure texts, associated with the minor city of Babylon, which itself was barely a footnote in the grand story of Sumerian civilization. Babylon sat on the Euphrates River in the central part of Mesopotamia, in a region that would later be called Akkad. But in these early days, it was overshadowed by its more illustrious neighbours. The great Sumerian city-states to the south, Ur and Uruk, commanded respect and fear. The northern city of Kish had already risen to dominance and fallen. Babylon was simply one more settlement in a landscape crowded with them, its god merely one more local deity in a pantheon that already numbered in the hundreds. Archaeological evidence suggests that Marduk's origins are obscure, possibly linked to an even earlier agricultural deity named Asaluhi. This connection is crucial. Asaluhi was a god of incantations and magic, a specialist deity who helped heal the sick and ward off demons. He was the son of Ea, which gave him a certain pedigree, but he was hardly a power player. His symbol was the spade, that most humble of farming tools, which would later become one of Marduk's identifying emblems. The triangular spade, the maru in Sumerian, may even be the origin of Marduk's name, though scholars debate this. Some argue the name derives from Amarutu, meaning bull calf of the sun god, suggesting a potential connection to solar worship. But this linguistic debate obscures a more important truth. Whatever his origins, Marduk began as a minor god with minor concerns. Farming, healing, local matters. He was not building universes or commanding storms. He was helping crops grow and curing fevers. Then everything changed. Around 1894 BCE, a new dynasty rose to power in Babylon. These were the Amorites, a Semitic-speaking people who had migrated into Mesopotamia from the west. They were outsiders, but they were ambitious. Under their rule, Babylon transformed from a backwater into the capital of an empire. And when a city rises, so must its god. The sixth king of this Amorite dynasty was named Hammurabi, and his reign from approximately 1792 to 1750 BCE marked a watershed moment not just for Babylon, but for the entire religious landscape of Mesopotamia. Hammurabi was a conqueror and a lawgiver. Through a combination of military genius and political cunning, he brought nearly all of Mesopotamia under Babylonian control. He defeated the ancient Sumerian cities of the south. He crushed the rival kingdoms of the north, and when the dust settled, Babylon stood supreme, the undisputed master of the land between the rivers. But here is where the story becomes more subtle, more complex than simple conquest. Hammurabi could have declared by force that Babylon was the centre of the world, that Marduk was the greatest god. He could have torn down the temples of Enlil and Anu and proclaimed a new divine order through military might alone. But he did not. Because Hammurabi understood something profound about power. He understood that true legitimacy comes not from the sword but from the mind, from belief, from the slow, patient reshaping of how people understand reality itself. During Hammurabi's reign, we see the first subtle elevations of Marduk. The king's famous law code, inscribed on a massive stone stele and displayed for all to see, contains an introduction that is as much religious proclamation as legal preamble. It begins by invoking Anu and Enlil, the traditional supreme gods, acknowledging their authority. But then it states that these ancient powers chose Marduk to promote the welfare of the people, to cause justice to prevail in the land. Notice the careful political choreography here. Hammurabi does not overthrow the old gods. He does not claim Marduk is supreme. Instead, he suggests that the traditional powers themselves have chosen Marduk as their agent, their representative, their chosen instrument to bring order to the world. This is the beginning of a process that scholars call syncretism, the gradual merging and absorption of one deity into another. During the Old Babylonian period, Marduk began to absorb the attributes of other gods. Most significantly, he was identified with Assyrian, that ancient god of incantations. The two names became interchangeable. Prayers addressed to Assyrian were now understood to be prayers to Marduk. This was not sacrilege, it was synthesis. The old god was not destroyed. He was incorporated, his powers and stories folded into the growing mythos of Babylon's patron deity. But even during Hammurabi's reign, Marduk was not yet supreme. The texts of this period make that clear. Enlil was still recognized as the highest authority. Marduk appeared more as a mediator between the great gods and the king, an important figure certainly, but not the ultimate power. He was rising, but he had not yet reached the zenith. Hammurabi's dynasty eventually fell. The first dynasty of Babylon ended around 1595 BCE when Hittite raiders sacked the city. Chaos followed. Foreign powers, the Kassites from the Zagros Mountains, seized control of Babylonia. For centuries the region was fragmented, contested, its former glory a fading memory. Babylon endured, but barely. Its great buildings fell into disrepair, its political influence waned. And yet mysteriously, during this period of political eclipse, Marduk's star continued to rise. This is one of the great paradoxes of ancient Mesopotamian religion. The god's power grew even as his city weakened. How can we explain this? Perhaps the answer lies in the human need for meaning in the face of chaos. When the world is unstable, when empires rise and fall with dizzying speed, people cling to their gods more tightly. They need to believe that there is order beneath the chaos, that someone is in control. Marduk, who had been positioned as a god of justice and order under Hammurabi, became a symbol of hope for restoration. He was the god who would make Babylon great again. He was the promise of a return to glory. Then, around 1125 BCE, something happened that would change everything. A Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar had accomplished what seemed impossible. He defeated the Elamites, the hated enemies from the east who had been ravaging Babylonia for generations, and he brought home a treasure. Not gold or silver, though he captured plenty of both. He brought home the statue of Marduk. You must understand what this statue meant. In Mesopotamian religion, a god did not merely reside in a statue. The statue, properly consecrated and ritually activated, became the god's physical body on earth. It was not a symbol, it was the actual presence of the deity. The Elamites had stolen Marduk's statue during one of their raids, a catastrophe that meant the god himself had been taken captive, that he had abandoned his city, that divine protection had been withdrawn. For generations, Babylon had been a city without its god. The temples stood empty, the rituals were incomplete. It was a spiritual crisis of the highest order. When Nebuchadnezzar returned the statue to Babylon in triumph, it was not just a political victory, it was cosmic restoration. The god had returned to his rightful home, order had been re-established, and the king who had achieved this miracle naturally wanted to commemorate it, to explain it, to give it meaning that would echo through the ages. It was during or shortly after the reign of Nebuchadnezzar III, most scholars now believe, that the great creation epic known as the Enuma Elish reached its final form. This was the text that would change everything. 7 tablets, nearly 1,000 lines of Akkadian poetry, a story that began with chaos and ended with Marduk enthroned as the undisputed king of all gods. But this was not just a new story. It was a revolutionary rewriting of Mesopotamian theology. It was in effect a religious coup, carried out not with weapons but with words, with myth, with the most powerful force in human civilization, narrative. The Enuma Elish, named for its opening words meaning "when on high," presents itself as the story of creation. But its true subject, its real purpose, is to explain and justify Marduk's supremacy. To understand its power, you must hear how it begins. When the skies above were not yet named, nor earth below pronounced by name, when only Apsu, the primeval fresh water, and Tiamat, the primeval salt water, existed, mingling their waters together, before any gods had been born, before destinies were decreed, then the gods were created. This is the universe before order, before names, before meaning. In the beginning there are only 2 forces, Apsu, representing the sweet fresh water that wells up from underground springs, and Tiamat, representing the salt water of the sea. These are not yet gods in the sense we understand, they are more like primordial principles, the raw elements from which everything else emerges. From the mingling of these waters, the first generation of gods is born, Lahmu, and Lahamu representing silt, the fertile mud where fresh and salt water meet. Then Anshar and Kishar, representing the horizons, the boundary between earth and sky. From Anshar comes Anu, the sky itself, and from Anu comes Ea, the god of wisdom and fresh water. These are the younger gods, and they are noisy. They move, they dance, they disturb the primordial peace. And Apsu, the ancient father, cannot sleep. He complains to Tiamat, "These children are too loud, they prevent me from resting, I will destroy them." Tiamat is horrified. "These are our children," she protests. "How can you speak of killing them?" But Apsu is determined. He plots with his vizier, Mamu, to annihilate the younger generation. This is a story that Mesopotamians understood in their bones. It echoes the eternal conflict between the old and the new, between stasis and change, between the conservative impulse to preserve what has always been, and the revolutionary drive to create something different. But Ea, the cleverest of the gods, discovers the plot, and in a stunning act of preemptive violence, he puts Apsu into a deep magical sleep and kills him. Think about what has just happened. The son has slain the father. The primordial order has been violated. Ea then builds his home on the remains of Apsu's body, making the fresh water his domain. And there, in this sacred place built upon patricide, Ea fathers a son with his wife Damkina. The child's name is Marduk. The text describes his birth in language that makes clear this is no ordinary deity. Marduk is born perfect, handsome beyond measure, powerful from his first moment. Ea gazes upon his son with pride and gives him a double portion of divinity, making him superior to all other gods. He has 4 eyes that see everything, 4 ears that hear all. When he speaks, fire blazes from his mouth. He is from birth designed for supremacy. But Tiamat has not forgotten. Her husband has been murdered. Her rest has been disturbed. And now, urged on by the other elder gods who fear what the younger generation might do next, she transforms. The mother becomes the monster. She gives birth to an army of chaos. The text lists them with relish, with a kind of horrified fascination. Giant serpents with venom for blood, dragons, mad dogs, scorpion men, fish men, monsters with the bodies of bulls and the faces of men. 11 terrible creatures, each more horrifying than the last. And at the head of this army she places Kingu, her new consort, a god she elevates and empowers by giving him the Tablet of Destinies, the ultimate symbol of cosmic authority. Whoever holds the Tablet of Destinies controls fate itself, can decree what will be and what will not be. It is the ultimate weapon, the ultimate power. When the younger gods learn of Tiamat's army, they are paralyzed with terror. They hold a council. Someone must fight. Someone must face the Chaos Dragon. Ea volunteers first, but when he approaches Tiamat and sees the full horror of what she has become, his wisdom and courage desert him. He retreats, then Anu, the sky god, tries. He too fails. Even the greatest of the old gods cannot stand against the primal chaos. This is the crisis moment. The universe itself hangs in the balance. If no one can defeat Tiamat, chaos will consume everything. Order will collapse. The world will return to the undifferentiated swirl of the primordial waters. Into this moment of supreme desperation steps Marduk. He is young, he is untested, but he is powerful and he is fearless. Or perhaps more accurately, he is ambitious, because Marduk does not volunteer out of pure heroism. He names his price. "I will fight Tiamat," he declares. "I will save you all, but if I succeed, if I defeat the Chaos Dragon and rescue the gods from annihilation, then I must be given supreme power. My word must become law. My command must be absolute. I will be king of all gods, and my authority can never be challenged or diminished." Imagine the desperation of that moment. The gods gather in assembly. They are afraid. They have no other champion. And so they agree. They hold a feast, get gloriously drunk on beer and wine, and in their intoxication they grant Marduk's demand. They give him a test. Place a constellation in the night sky, they tell him. Make it disappear, then make it reappear. If you can do this, if you can control reality with your words alone, then you have the power to be our king. Marduk speaks. The constellation vanishes. He speaks again. It returns. The gods erupt in celebration. He has passed the test. They invest him with supreme authority, give him weapons, the bow, the mace, lightning, a net woven from the winds themselves, and they send him forth to battle. The confrontation between Marduk and Tiamat is one of the great combat myths of the ancient world. Marduk rides a storm chariot pulled by 4 supernatural horses. He is clothed in terrifying armour and crowned with an aura of divine majesty. Behind him march the gods, drunk and disorganised, but loyal now to their chosen champion. Tiamat sees him coming. She roars her challenge. They hurl insults at each other, divine trash talk before the ultimate cage match, and then they engage. Tiamat opens her massive jaws to swallow Marduk whole, but he sends the 4 winds into her mouth, inflating her body like a grotesque balloon. She cannot close her mouth, cannot move, and in that moment of helplessness, Marduk fires an arrow straight through her gaping jaws. It pierces her heart. The ancient mother, the primordial chaos, falls dead. Marduk then captures her army. The 11 monsters are bound and imprisoned. Kingu, her consort, is taken alive, and from his body Marduk seizes the Tablet of Destinies, the ultimate cosmic authority. But the true horror, or the true genius, depending on your perspective, comes next. Marduk stands over Tiamat's corpse and draws his blade. He splits her body in half like a shellfish. From one half he raises the dome of the sky. From the other half he lays down the earth. He uses her ribs to create the vault of heaven. Her tears become the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Her tail becomes the Milky Way. Nothing is wasted. The Chaos Dragon is not merely defeated. She is repurposed, transformed, made into the very structure of the ordered cosmos. It is an act of cosmic recycling, and it carries a profound message. Chaos is not destroyed. It is controlled, organised, made useful. Tiamat still exists. The universe is literally made from her body, but she exists now only as Marduk allows, in the form he has chosen, serving the purposes he has decreed. With the universe created from Tiamat's remains, Marduk sets about organising reality. He establishes the calendar, assigning 12 months to 12 gods. He creates the constellations and sets the planets in their courses. He makes the moon to measure time and gives the sun its daily path across the sky. He assigns each major god a position and a duty. heaven is divided from earth. The upper realm is given to 300 gods called the Agigi. The lower realm is given to the Anunnaki, sometimes numbered at 50, sometimes at 300. Every deity has a place. Every force of nature has its god, and all of them, every single one, answer to a Marduk. But there is one final act of creation. The gods, even in victory, are exhausted. The work of maintaining the cosmos is enormous. Who will serve the gods? Who will bring them offerings and tend their temples? Marduk announces his solution. He will create mankind. But from what material? Ea suggests that one of the gods be sacrificed. They bring forth Kingu, Tiamat's consort, the god who led her army. Kingu is executed. His blood is mixed with clay. And from this mixture, humanity is formed. Think carefully about what this story is saying. Humans are created from the blood of a rebellious god, a being who defied the cosmic order. This explains why humans have divine intelligence. A god's blood runs in their veins, but also why they are flawed, prone to rebellion, to questioning authority. And humans are created for a specific purpose. Not to be God's beloved children, not to be their companions, but to be their servants, their workforce. The gods can rest because humans will do the work. Humans will farm the land, build the temples, present the offerings. The entire reason for human existence in this theology is to serve divine needs. This is revolutionary theology wrapped in the language of creation myth. But the enuma elish is not finished. In gratitude for their liberation from labour, the gods decide to build a city for Marduk. They will construct a temple that reaches the heavens, a dwelling place worthy of the king of the gods. For a year they make bricks, then they build. They erect the Esagila, the temple whose top is lofty, Marduk's earthly palace in the city of Babylon. And when it is complete, they gather there for a great feast. At this feast, the final and perhaps most important act occurs. The gods, all of them, gather to proclaim Marduk's titles. They will give him 50 names. 50 is the sacred number of Enlil, the old chief of the pantheon. By receiving 50 names, Marduk is not just becoming supreme, he is absorbing Enlil's authority. He is taking the power that belonged to the ancient gods and making it his own. The list of 50 names is not just random epithets. It is a systematic absorption of the entire Mesopotamian pantheon into Marduk. As each name is proclaimed, it comes with an explanation of the power that name represents. And as you listen to them, you realise, what is happening? Marduk is being identified with Ea in his aspect as creator of the Abzu. He is a Sali who purifies and heals. He is Enlil in sovereignty and command. He is Anu in authority over heaven. He is Shamash in judgment and justice. He is Sin in measuring time. He is Adad in bringing rain. One by one, the major gods of Mesopotamia are named, and one by one their powers are declared to be aspects of Marduk. The text is explicit about this. It states that the other gods are no longer separate beings. They are merely different manifestations of Marduk's single supreme divinity. This is bordering on monotheism. Not quite there, because the other gods still exist, still have their cults and temples, but they exist now only as extensions of Marduk's will, as facets of his supreme personality. The epic ends with a solemn charge. These names must be taught. Fathers must recite them to sons. Priests must memorize them. They are not mere poetry, they are theology. They are the new understanding of how the universe works. This is how you conquer a pantheon. Not by denying the old gods, not by tearing down their temples, but by absorbing them. By reinterpreting their myths so that every story ultimately points to the supremacy of your chosen deity. It is brilliant. It is audacious. And it worked. The Enuma Elish became the most important religious text in Babylonia. It was recited annually during the Akitu festival, the great New Year celebration held each spring. This was not just any festival. It was the central ritual of Babylonian religion, a 12-day extravaganza that renewed the cosmos for another year. On the 4th day of the festival, in the evening, the high priest would enter the inner sanctum of the Asagla temple. There, before the golden statue of Marduk, he would recite the Enuma Elish from beginning to end. Every single line. This was not a prayer. It was a ritual enactment. By speaking the words of creation, the priest was, in effect, recreating the universe, ensuring that order would prevail over chaos for another year, that Marduk's kingship would continue, that Babylon would remain the centre of the cosmos. But the Akitu festival was also intensely political. Before the recitation could begin, the king of Babylon had to perform a ritual of humiliation. He would enter the temple, remove all his royal regalia, his crown, his scepter, his robes, and kneel before the statue of Marduk. The high priest would slap him across the face, pull his ears, force him to recite a confession. "I have not sinned, O Lord. I have not been negligent of your divinity. I have not destroyed Babylon. I have not caused it to be shaken." If the king wept during this ordeal, it was a good omen. It meant Marduk was pleased. Only then would the priest return the king's regalia. Only then would his authority be renewed for another year. Think about what this ritual is doing. It is declaring that the king's power is not his own. It derives entirely from Marduk. The king is not divine, he is Marduk's servant. Babylon's power is not its own, it flows from its god. This is religious ideology operating at the highest level. Using ritual to encode political truth into the bodies and minds of the participants. The physical heart of this religious system was the Asagala temple complex, the most magnificent architectural achievement in ancient Babylon. The Asagala itself was the main temple building, a vast structure with multiple courts and chambers. At its centre was the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum where the golden statue of Marduk resided. This statue was not just symbolically important, it was politically and economically crucial. Made of gold and silver, adorned with precious stones, it represented an enormous concentration of wealth. It was the bank, the treasury, and the throne room all in one. To take the hands of Marduk, as the phrase went, meant to grasp the hands of the statue in a ritual of coronation. A new king could not legitimize his rule without performing this ceremony. If you controlled Marduk's statue, you controlled Babylon. If you possessed it, legitimacy was yours. This is why foreign conquerors were so obsessed with the statue. The Elamites stole it. The Hittites tried to. The Assyrians carried it off to Assur multiple times, and each time it was removed, it was a catastrophe, a sign that Marduk had withdrawn his favour, that cosmic order had collapsed. North of the Esagila stood an even more iconic structure. The ziggurat called a Temenanki, the foundation platform of heaven and earth. This was the building that would inspire one of the most famous stories in the Bible, the Tower of Babel. Though scholars still debate the exact dimensions, excavations have confirmed that the structure had a base measuring approximately 91 metres on each side. It rose in 7 distinct terraces, each one smaller than the one below, creating a massive step pyramid that dominated the Babylon skyline. Ancient sources claim it stood between 54 and 91 metres tall, though the exact height remains contested. Regardless of the precise measurement, it was enormous, visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. At the summit, reached by a series of monumental staircases, stood a small temple. This was Marduk's sky chamber, the place where heaven and earth met. Here, once a year during the Akitu festival, a sacred marriage ritual may have been performed. The details are murky, lost in the mists of time. But some texts suggest that the high priestess and the king would ascend to the summit and perform a ritual union, a symbolic recreation of the cosmic marriage between the god and the goddess, between order and chaos, ensuring fertility for the land and prosperity for the people. The Greek historian Herodotus, who claimed to have visited Babylon in the 5th century BCE, described the ziggurat with a mixture of awe and confusion. He spoke of 8 towers standing one atop the other, though this may be a misunderstanding of the terrace structure. He mentioned that there was no statue in the uppermost shrine, only a bed and a golden table, and that a woman was left there to spend the night, chosen by the god himself. Whether this is accurate reportage or salacious gossip is impossible to know. What is certain is that Temenanki captured the ancient imagination. It was the architectural embodiment of Marduk's power, a literal stairway to heaven, proof that Babylon was the cosmic axis, the centre point around which the entire universe revolved. The building of such a structure required an immense investment of resources, labour and time. It was a statement, a declaration that Babylon was not merely a city but the city, the earthly counterpart to the heavenly realm, the place where divine and human realms intersected. For the Babylonians, geography was theology. Babylon was not just politically supreme, it was cosmically central, and Marduk's temples were not just beautiful buildings, they were the anchors holding the universe in place. But temples and myths, no matter how powerful, do not maintain themselves. They require continuous political backing, and here the story of Marduk's supremacy becomes intertwined with the rise and fall of empires. After Nebuchadnezzar was returned Marduk's statue, and perhaps oversaw the final composition of the enuma elish, Babylonia experienced centuries of decline and foreign domination. The Assyrians, the terrifying military juggernaut from northern Mesopotamia, conquered Babylon repeatedly, and each time they faced a theological problem. The Assyrians had their own supreme god, Ashur, the deified personification of their capital city. Ashur was a war god, fierce and implacable, perfectly suited to a nation of conquerors. But when the Assyrians conquered Babylon, they inherited a theological crisis. How could Ashur be supreme if Babylon, the cosmic centre, belonged to Marduk? Their solution was fascinating. They created alternate versions of the enuma elish, versions in which the hero who defeats Tiamat is not Marduk but Ashur. They performed the same textual surgery that the Babylonians themselves had performed on earlier Sumerian myths. Simply search and replace, change the name of the protagonist, keep the structure of the story the same. This was acceptable because the underlying theology of the enuma elish was about the triumph of order over chaos, of civilization over the wild. The specific name of the champion was, in a sense, less important than the pattern. You could plug in your own god as long as he fit the archetype. This reveals something profound about ancient Near Eastern religion. It was remarkably flexible. Syncretism was the norm, not the exception. Gods could be identified with one another. Myths could be transferred. Theology was not fixed and frozen, but organic and adaptive. Yet for all the Assyrian attempts to co-opt the Babylonian religious narrative, Marduk's cult proved remarkably resilient. Babylon itself became a symbol of resistance. When the Assyrians ruled harshly, when they demanded tribute and enforced their will with brutality, Marduk's cult became a rallying point for Babylonian identity. To worship Marduk was to assert that Babylon, not Assur, was the true centre of the world. It was religious nationalism, a form of resistance that could not be stamped out by military force. This reached its zenith in the Neo-Babylonian period, the final flowering of Mesopotamian civilization. In 626 BCE, a Chaldean chieftain named Nabopolassar seized control of Babylon and declared independence from the crumbling Assyrian Empire. His son Nebuchadnezzar II would become one of the most famous kings in history. Reigning from 605 to 562 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar was a builder and a conqueror. He rebuilt Babylon on a scale that dwarfed anything that had come before. He constructed the famous Ishtar Gate, covered in glazed blue bricks and decorated with reliefs of dragons and bulls. He fortified the city with massive walls, so thick that chariots could race on top of them. And most importantly, he lavished attention on Marduk's temples. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions make clear that he saw himself as Marduk's chosen instrument. He claims that Marduk called him by name, selected him from among all men to restore the gods' dwelling places. The king personally oversaw the reconstruction of Temenanki, claiming that he raised its summit to rival the heavens. He rebuilt the Asagla with imported cedar from Lebanon for its roof beams and adorned it with precious metals and stones. This was not just piety, it was propaganda. By positioning himself as Marduk's devoted servant, Nebuchadnezzar claimed legitimacy not just as a Babylonian king, but as the ruler of the entire civilized world. Marduk was the king of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar was Marduk's earthly regent. Therefore, all nations should bow to Babylon. This ideological framework is crucial for understanding Nebuchadnezzar's most infamous act, the conquest of Jerusalem and the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BCE. From a Babylonian perspective, this was not cruelty. It was cosmic necessity. Jerusalem had rebelled. Its God had failed to protect it. This proved that Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, was inferior to Marduk. The Babylonians carted away the treasures of the temple, including the sacred vessels used in worship, and brought them to Babylon, placing them in Marduk's temple. This was a theological statement. Even Yahweh's holy objects now served Marduk. For the exiled Jews in Babylon, this was a crisis that shook their faith to its foundations. How could Yahweh have allowed this? Why was his temple destroyed? Why were his people enslaved? Some of the exiles began to ask the unthinkable question, was Marduk actually more powerful? Was the Babylonian god the true supreme deity? The prophets of Israel responded with fierce rhetoric. They insisted that the exile was not a sign of Yahweh's weakness, but of his judgment. The destruction was punishment for Israel's sins, and more radically, they began to assert a revolutionary claim. Yahweh was not just the God of Israel, he was the God of all the earth. There were no other gods. Marduk did not exist, or if he did, he was merely a powerless idol. This is the context in which the book of Isaiah contains its famous mockery of Babylonian religion. The prophet describes craftsmen carving a piece of wood in half, burning one half for cooking, and carving the other half into an idol, then bowing down to worship it. The absurdity is the point. How can a god be made by human hands? But there is another layer to the Jewish response, one that is more subtle and more sophisticated. Some scholars argue that the creation account in Genesis 1, with its emphasis on God speaking the world into existence, creating order from a watery chaos called tihom in Hebrew, is a deliberate polemic against the enuma elish. The similarities are too striking to be coincidental. Both begin with watery chaos. Both involve the separation of waters and the creation of the dome of the sky. Both establish a calendar and assign authority to celestial bodies. But the differences are even more important. In Genesis, there is no battle, no cosmic conflict. God simply speaks and reality obeys. Chaos is not a dragon to be defeated. It is simply the absence of order, which God fills by his word alone. And humanity is not created from the blood of a slain rebel god to be slaves. Humans are made in God's image, given dominion over creation, blessed and told to be fruitful. It is a radical rewriting of the Mesopotamian story, a conscious rejection of Marduk's theology. If this interpretation is correct, then Genesis 1 is one of the Bible's first and most profound acts of counter-mythology. The Jewish exiles heard the enuma elish recited every year at the Akitu festival. They saw the might of Babylon, they witnessed Marduk's supremacy, and they responded by writing their own creation story, one that asserted their God needed no battle to create, no army to support him, no slaves to serve him. It was theological warfare waged through competing narratives. But Babylon's glory was brief. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon without a battle. The city's gates were opened from within, and suddenly Marduk had a new servant. Or did he? This is where the story takes another strange turn. Cyrus, a Zoroastrian Persian who worshipped Ahura Mazda, not Marduk, nevertheless claimed that Marduk had chosen him to liberate Babylon from the wickedness of its last king, Nabonidus. Cyrus issued a famous propaganda text now known as the Cyrus Cylinder, in which he claims that Marduk searched through all the lands looking for a righteous ruler and chose Cyrus. The Persian king performed the traditional rituals, took the hands of Marduk, and presented himself as the god's chosen champion. Whether Cyrus actually believed this or whether it was pure political theatre is unknown, but it reveals the continued power of Marduk's cult. Even foreign conquerors felt compelled to acknowledge him, to claim his blessing, to position themselves within the Babylonian theological framework. You could conquer Babylon by force, but to truly rule it, you needed Marduk's approval. Yet there were limits. Another Persian king, Xerxes, did not play by the rules. After Babylon revolted in 482 BCE, Xerxes crushed the rebellion with brutal efficiency. And then, according to some sources, he did the unthinkable. He melted down the golden statue of Marduk. This act, if it truly occurred, was cultural genocide. It was a declaration that Marduk's power was broken, that Babylon would no longer be treated as special. The city declined rapidly after this. The temples fell into disrepair. The great rituals were no longer performed. By the time Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BC, Etemenanki was a ruin. Alexander, ever the romantic, ordered it rebuilt, but he died before the work was completed, and his successors, the Seleucid Greeks who inherited his empire, had little interest in Mesopotamian religion. Babylon was gradually abandoned. The Euphrates River changed course. Sand buried the ruins. The great city that had been the cosmic centre, the place where heaven and earth met, became a wasteland. The last documented use of cuneiform writing dates to 75 CE. After that, silence. The language in which the enuma elish was written was forgotten. The script could no longer be read. Marduk's 50 names were lost. The story of the god who conquered all others faded into the mists of legend. For nearly 2,000 years, Babylon was a name from the Bible, a symbol of decadence and idolatry, but its actual history was unknown. Then, in the mid-19th century, archaeologists began digging. They unearthed the ruins of Mesopotamian cities. They found libraries filled with clay tablets, and they began the slow, painstaking work of relearning cuneiform, of piecing together the shattered fragments of ancient texts. In 1849, the English archaeologist Austin Henry Layard excavated the ruins of Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. In the remains of King Ashurbanipal's great library, he found thousands of tablets. Among them were broken pieces of the enuma elish. It was George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist who had begun his career as a banknote engraver, who first recognised what these tablets contained. In 1806 he published his groundbreaking work, The Chaldean Account of Genesis, revealing to the Victorian world that the Babylonians had their own creation story, one that bore striking similarities to the Bible. The reaction was explosive. To conservative Christians, this was heresy, a suggestion that the Bible was not unique, that it had borrowed from pagan mythology. To scholars, it opened up an entirely new field of comparative religion. Suddenly, the ancient Near East was not just a backdrop for biblical history. It was a rich, complex civilization with its own sophisticated theology. As more tablets were discovered and more texts translated, the full scope of Marduk's cult became clear. He was not just a Babylonian god. He was for a time the supreme deity of the ancient world's most powerful civilization. His myths had influenced neighbouring cultures. His theology had provoked responses from Jewish prophets. His temples had hosted the coronations of emperors. Today, visitors to the Louvre in Paris can see the iconic dragon of Marduk, the Mushhush-shu, reconstructed from the glazed bricks of Babylon's Ishtar Gate. This fantastic creature, with the body of a serpent, the head of a dragon, the front legs of a lion, and the rear legs of an eagle, was Marduk's sacred animal. It appeared everywhere in Babylon, a constant reminder of the god's power. The dragon itself has a history. When Hammurabi defeated the city of Eshnunna around 1760 BCE, he claimed that Marduk had defeated Eshnunna's patron god, Tishpak. Marduk then appropriated Tishpak's symbol, the Mushhush-shu, as his own. It is a perfect symbol for Marduk's entire history. A god who rises to power by absorbing the attributes, the stories, and even the sacred animals of other deities. A god built through syncretism and political manoeuvring. A god who represents the ultimate triumph of narrative over history, of mythology over reality. Because here is the deepest truth about Marduk. He may have never existed as the Babylonians imagined him. There was no cosmic battle, no dragon slain, no universe created from a corpse, but Marduk was real in the way that ideas are real, in the way that stories shape civilizations. For 1,000 years, millions of people ordered their lives around his worship. Kings rose and fell based on his favour. Armies marched under his banner. Empires justified their conquests in his name. Marduk shows us something profound about the relationship between religion and power. Gods do not simply exist. They are made. They are crafted through political processes, through the slow accumulation of myths and attributes, through the systematic absorption of competing cults. The enuma elish was not ancient wisdom. It was propaganda, brilliant propaganda, but propaganda nonetheless. It was a document designed to legitimize Babylon's political dominance by asserting that dominance had cosmic sanction. Marduk did not conquer the other gods through divine might. He conquered them through narrative, through the patient rewriting of mythology, until every other god's story became a chapter in his story. This is the real lesson of Marduk's rise. Power requires narrative. Raw force can conquer cities, but to rule them, to make conquest permanent, you need a story that people believe. You need a mythology that makes your dominance seem natural, inevitable, cosmically ordained. The Babylonians understood this instinctively. They did not just conquer with armies. They conquered with temples and rituals and myths. They rewrote the religious landscape to put their god at the centre, and they did it so successfully that even their conquerors felt compelled to acknowledge Marduk's supremacy. And perhaps there is a warning here for our own time. We live in an age of competing narratives, of information warfare, of stories deliberately crafted to shape how we understand reality. We like to think we are more sophisticated than the ancient Babylonians, that we see through propaganda, that we base our beliefs on facts and evidence. But the techniques that elevated Marduk are still with us. The slow absorption of competing ideas into a dominant framework, the rewriting of history to legitimize present power, the use of ritual and symbolism to encode beliefs so deeply that they become invisible, just the way things are. Marduk's story is not ancient history. It is a template, a pattern that has repeated throughout human civilization. It is the story of how a local god became universal, how a myth became truth, how narrative became reality. The ziggurat of Etemenanki lies in ruins, buried under Iraqi sand. The Asagila temple is a hole in the ground, its golden statue melted down millennia ago. The priests who recited the enuma elish are dust, but the pattern persists. The techniques remain, the lesson endures. So, the next time someone tells you a story about how the world works, about why certain people deserve to rule, about what is natural and what is forbidden, remember Marduk, remember how a farming god with a spade became the supreme architect of reality. Remember how myths are made, remember that the gods who seem most powerful, most eternal, most obviously supreme, were often not very long ago minor figures in a crowded pantheon. They rose not through inherent divinity but through human ambition, through political calculation, through the deliberate crafting of narrative. This is not to say that all religion is merely politics, that would be reductive. But it is to say that religion and politics are inseparable, that theology is always shaped by power, that the stories we tell about the gods reveal more about ourselves than about heaven. Marduk conquered all the other gods, but he did so because the people who worshipped him conquered all the other cities. The divine conquest followed the earthly one. The cosmic war was a reflection of human ambition, and when Babylon fell, when the empire crumbled, when the temples were abandoned, Marduk fell with them. Because a god's power is only as enduring as the civilization that sustains his worship. You stand now at the end of this journey, surrounded by the ghosts of an ancient faith. The tablets have been read, the story has been told, and you are left with a question that has no easy answer. What does it mean that the God who once claimed to have created the universe, who absorbed the powers of every deity in Mesopotamia, who was worshipped by millions as the king of heaven and earth, is now studied only by scholars, known only as a name in history books? Does it mean the Babylonians were simply wrong, that they worshipped a false god who never had any power? Or does it mean something more unsettling, that all gods rise and fall with the civilizations that create them? That divinity itself is subject to the currents of history? The answer, perhaps, depends on whether you believe gods make civilizations or civilizations make gods. But one thing is certain. Marduk's story, the tale of the god who conquered all others, is really the story of Babylon's rise to power. And when Babylon fell, the god fell with it. The cosmic drama was always in the end a human drama. The battle in the heavens was always a battle on earth. And the god who claimed to have shaped reality was himself shaped by it, moulded by the ambitions, fears and needs of the people who carved his image in stone and recited his names in the darkness of the temple. The tablets are silent now, the rituals are not performed. The 50 names of Marduk are no longer chanted. But the pattern persists, the story continues, and if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echo of that ancient ambition, the voice that dared to claim supreme power, that rewrote the cosmos in its own image, that transformed a local deity into the king of all creation. That voice speaks still in different tongues and different forms, but always with the same message. I am supreme. I have conquered all others. My word is law. My story is the only story that matters. This is the voice of Marduk. This is the voice of empire. And it never truly dies. It only changes names. But before we reach that ending, there are layers to this story we have not yet explored. The daily reality of Marduk's worship. The intricate mechanics of how his cult actually functioned. The economics of divine service. Because understanding Marduk means understanding not just the grand myths, but the mundane realities. The priests who woke before dawn to wash and dress the god's statue. The farmers who tithed their grain to his temple. The scribes who recorded every offering. The musicians who played before his shrine. This was not just theology. This was a functioning system that employed thousands, that controlled vast wealth, that shaped every aspect of Babylonian life. The daily service of Marduk followed a precise ritual schedule that had been codified over centuries. Before sunrise, the high priest would enter the Asagila temple complex, having purified himself through ritual bathing and donning special linen garments. He would proceed through a series of courtyards, each one more sacred than the last, passing through gates guarded by colossal statues of the Mushushu dragon. Finally, he would reach the inner sanctum, a small windowless chamber lit only by oil lamps. There stood the statue of Marduk, approximately life-sized or perhaps larger, made of wood covered in sheets of hammered gold and silver. His robes were of the finest cloth, changed regularly according to the season. In his right hand he held a sceptre. In his left, the ring and rod, ancient symbols of justice and measurement. The priest's first duty was to awaken the ka. He would sing hymns, burn incense, and formally announce the arrival of a new day. Then came the washing ceremony. Using water drawn from a sacred well within the temple complex, water that was believed to connect to the primordial Abzu, the priest would ritually cleanse the statue's face and hands. This was not symbolic. The Babylonians believed the god truly resided in the statue through a ritual called the opening of the mouth, performed when the statue was first consecrated. The god could see through the statue's eyes, smell the incense through its nostrils, consume the food placed before it. After washing, the priest would anoint the statue with perfumed oils, cedar oil from Lebanon, myrrh from Arabia. Then came the dressing, the careful arrangement of new garments and jewellery. Finally, the morning meal would be presented. Bread, beer, dates, meat, all placed on offering tables before the statue. The god would be left alone to eat, his privacy sacred. After a suitable interval, the priests would return and remove the offerings, which would then be divided among the temple personnel as their payment. This was how the priests and their families ate, the god's leftovers. This ritual was repeated twice daily, at morning and evening, and this was just the basic service. On festival days, the ceremonies became far more elaborate. The statue would be carried in procession through the city streets. Musicians would play, singers would chant hymns, the entire population would turn out to witness their god parading through Babylon in his sacred boat-shaped palanquin, carried on the shoulders of priests. These processions served multiple functions. They were acts of devotion, certainly, but they were also political theatre. They demonstrated the temple's wealth and power. They reinforced social hierarchies, with each person having an assigned place in the procession based on their status. And they created a shared communal experience that bound the population together through participation in something greater than themselves. The most important of these festivals was, of course, the akitu, the New Year celebration that we have mentioned but not fully explored. The Akitu festival was a 12-day event that occurred twice a year, once in the spring month of Nisanu and once in the autumn, though the spring celebration was the more important. The entire festival was built around the recitation of the enuma elish and the ritual reenactment of Marduk's victory over chaos, but it was far more than just storytelling. It was a comprehensive renewal of the cosmic, political and social order. On the first day, the high priest would begin special purification rituals. The Esagila temple would be cleansed. Evil spirits would be exorcised from its courts. This cleansing was both practical and symbolic. It prepared the sacred space for what was to come, but it also represented the clearing away of the old year's accumulated chaos and disorder. On the second and third days, craftsmen would create 2 special figurines representing Tiamat's monsters. These would be used in later rituals and then destroyed, symbolizing the defeat of chaos. The fourth day was when things became truly dramatic. This was the day of the enuma elish recitation. But before that could occur, the king had to undergo his ritual humiliation, which we have touched upon but must now examine in detail. The ceremony began with the king entering the temple in full royal regalia. He would approach the inner sanctum, but would not be permitted to enter. At the threshold, priests would surround him. They would remove his crown, his sceptre, his royal seal. They would strip away his robes, leaving him in a simple undergarment. Thus reduced, the king would kneel before the statue of Marduk. The high priest would approach and slap him hard across the face. Then the priest would pull the king's ears, a gesture of control and discipline. The king would then recite a negative confession, a ritual denial of wrongdoing. "I have not sinned, Lord of the lands. I have not been negligent of your divinity. I have not destroyed Babylon. I have not caused its foundations to shake. I have not struck the cheek of a subordinate. I have not humiliated them. I have watched over Babylon. I have not smashed its walls." As the king recited these words, he would weep, or he was expected to weep. If tears did not come naturally, the high priest would pull his ears harder until they did. Because the king's tears were crucial. They were a sign that he was properly humble before the god, that he understood his position as Marduk's servant, that his power was not his own, but granted and could be withdrawn. Only after this humiliation would the high priest return the royal insignia. He would place the crown back on the king's head, hand him the scepter, and formally declare that Marduk accepted his service for another year. The king's power was renewed. But everyone watching understood the lesson. The king was not divine, he ruled only at Marduk's pleasure, and Marduk's will was interpreted by the priesthood. This ritual was political genius. It gave the priests enormous leverage over even the most powerful monarch. After the king's humiliation and reinvestment, the high priest would enter the inner sanctum alone and recite the entire enuma elish, every line, every tablet. This recitation was not performed for an audience. The doors were closed. Only the priest and the god were present. This emphasizes that the recitation was not entertainment. It was a magical act. By speaking the words of creation, the priest was, in effect, resetting the cosmic order. He was rewinding the universe to the moment after Marduk's victory and restarting time. This is why the ritual had to be performed perfectly. A mistake, a mispronunciation, could have catastrophic consequences. The cosmic order might not be properly renewed. Chaos might slip back in. On the fifth day, the ritual became even more complex. The temple would be purified again, this time with the blood of a sacrificed ram. A priest wearing the ram's skin would walk through every room of the temple complex, symbolically absorbing all impurity. Then this priest would be expelled from the city, sent into the wilderness, carrying away the sins and chaos of the old year. This is remarkably similar to the Jewish ritual of the scapegoat described in Leviticus, and many scholars believe the practices influenced each other during the Babylonian exile. The 6th through 8th days involved the assembly of the gods. The statues of all the major deities from the surrounding cities would be brought to Babylon in a sacred procession. They would be installed in temporary shrines within the Asagular complex. This gathering represented the cosmic assembly described in the enuma elish, when all the gods came together to acknowledge Marduk's supremacy and receive their assigned duties. Each statue would be ritually fed, offerings would be presented, and the theological message was clear. All these gods were present to honour Marduk. Babylon was not just supreme politically, it was supreme cosmically. On the 9th day came what was probably the most dramatic public event of the entire festival, the sacred marriage. Though the exact nature of this ritual is debated, and the evidence is fragmentary, it appears that a ritual sexual union was performed either between the king and a high priestess representing the goddess Sarpnit, Marduk's consort, or symbolically between the statues of the two deities. This union was believed to ensure fertility for the land, the crops would grow, the livestock would reproduce, the people would prosper. It was sympathetic magic on a cosmic scale, as above, so below. The divine marriage guaranteed earthly abundance. The 10th and 11th days involved a grand procession to a special building outside the city walls called the akitu, the House of the New Year festival. This structure, whose ruins have been found by archaeologists, was essentially a second temple complex connected to the main city by a sacred processional way. The journey from the Asagular to the akitu was the festival's climax. Marduk's statue would be carried in his sacred boat palanquin, accompanied by the king, the assembled divine statues from other cities, the priesthood in their finest robes, musicians, singers, and the entire population of Babylon lining the route. The procession moved along a road called the Processional Way, which was paved with limestone slabs and lined on both sides by walls decorated with reliefs of the Mushushu dragon and the Bull of Adad. This was the same road that passed through the Ishtar Gate, that magnificent structure covered in glazed blue bricks that we can still see reconstructed in Berlin's Pergamon Museum. As the procession passed, the people would chant hymns, throw flowers, and prostrate themselves before their god. Once at the akitu, the final rituals would be performed, the exact nature of which remains mysterious. But they likely involved a symbolic reenactment of Marduk's battle with Tiamat, with priests wearing costumes representing the chaos monsters. The god would defeat them once more, order would triumph over chaos, and the world would be safe for another year. On the 12th and final day, the procession would return to the city. The visiting divine statues would be sent back to their home temples, the Asagular would be restored to its normal state, and life would resume. But everyone who participated would carry with them the memory of what they had witnessed. They had seen their god triumph, they had seen their king humbled and restored, they had participated in the renewal of cosmic order, they had been part of something vast and eternal. This was the real power of the Akitu festival. It was not just ritual, it was the creation of meaning. It transformed time from a linear progression of random events into a cycle, a pattern that repeated eternally. Each year brought not just arbitrary change, but the same eternal struggle: chaos versus order, Tiamat versus Marduk. And each year, Marduk won. This provided profound psychological comfort. No matter how chaotic the world seemed, no matter what disasters occurred, the underlying pattern was stable. Order always triumphed in the end. Understanding the Akitu festival also helps us understand the economics of Marduk's cult, which was staggering. The temple complex was not just a religious institution, it was the largest employer in Babylon, the biggest landowner, and one of the wealthiest entities in the entire ancient Near East. The Esagila owned vast estates throughout Babylonia. Entire villages worked temple-owned land. Their harvests would be brought to massive temple granaries. Some of this grain fed the temple personnel, the priests, the musicians, the scribes, the guards, the maintenance workers. But much of it was loaned out at interest to farmers who needed seed grain, creating a credit system that made the temple a de facto bank. The temple also owned workshops where craftsmen produced luxury goods, fine textiles, jewellery, furniture. These would be sold in the marketplace or given as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers. The temple collected taxes in the form of tithes. Every farmer was expected to give a portion of his harvest. Every merchant was expected to contribute a percentage of his profits. These were not voluntary donations. They were legal obligations enforced by the state. Failure to pay could result in loss of land or even enslavement. The wealth concentrated in the Esagila was almost unimaginable. Ancient inventories survive that list the temple's possessions. Hundreds of pounds of gold and silver, mountains of grain, herds of cattle and sheep, forests of cedar logs, jars of wine and oil, bolts of the finest cloth. And all of this belonged to Marduk, or rather, it belonged to the institution that managed his earthly affairs, the priesthood. This created a potential tension. The priests controlled enormous resources in the name of the god, but they were the ones who actually decided how those resources would be used. They could interpret the god's will however they wished. This gave them power that rivaled or even exceeded that of the king. Kings needed the priest's cooperation to be legitimized, but priests needed the king's military power to protect the temple and enforce the collection of tithes. It was a delicate balance, a symbiotic relationship that could sometimes become hostile. We see this tension play out most dramatically during the reign of Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon before the Persian conquest. Nabonidus, who ruled from 556 to 539 BC, was an antiquarian and a religious radical. He became obsessed with the moon god Sin, the ancient deity of the city of Haran where his mother had been a priestess. Nabonidus began promoting the cult of Sin at the expense of Marduk. He left Babylon for a decade, living in the Arabian oasis of Taimar, and refusing to return to perform his duties in the Akitu festival. This was a catastrophe. Without the king present to be humiliated and reinvested, without the royal participation in the ritual, the Akitu could not be properly performed. The cosmic order was not renewed. The priests and the population were horrified. They saw Nabonidus as impious, as abandoning Marduk. When Cyrus the Persian arrived at Babylon's gates in 539 BCE, the city surrendered without a fight. The gates were open from within, and Cyrus presented himself not as a conqueror, but as Marduk's chosen liberator, the righteous king who would restore proper worship. The famous Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel inscribed with propaganda, presents the Persian version of events. It claims that Marduk searched all the lands for a righteous ruler and chose Cyrus. The text describes Nabonidus as a wicked king who distorted the rituals and made the daily offering cease. Whether this is accurate or simply Persian propaganda is debatable, but the very existence of this text shows how powerful the Marduk cult remained. Even foreign conquerors felt compelled to claim his blessing. They had to work within the Babylonian theological framework or risk losing the city's cooperation. This is the real test of a god's power. Not what his own worshippers believe, but what his enemies are forced to acknowledge. And for centuries, every power that controlled Babylon, Assyrians, Persians, even initially the Greeks, bowed to Marduk. They might worship other gods in their own lands, but in Babylon they became Marduk's servants. This changed only gradually with the rise of Hellenism and the Seleucid Empire. The Greeks who inherited Alexander's conquests were less willing to participate in native religious traditions. They built Greek-style temples to Greek gods. They promoted Greek as the language of administration. Slowly, Babylon's traditional culture was marginalized. The last cuneiform texts we possess that mention Marduk's cult date to the 1st century BCE. After that, silence. The priests who knew the ancient rituals died. Their sons learned Greek instead of Akkadian. The temples were abandoned, the statues were lost or destroyed, and Marduk, the god who had once claimed to rule all of heaven and earth, was forgotten, or was he? Because here is where the story takes another turn. While Marduk himself vanished from worship, his mythology did not entirely die. It was transformed, absorbed, and echoed in later traditions. We have already mentioned the influence on Genesis, but the connection goes deeper. Some scholars argue that the combat myth at the heart of the enuma elish, the battle between a storm god and a sea dragon, is a pattern that appears across the ancient Near East and beyond. In Canaanite mythology, Baal battles Yam, the sea. In Hittite mythology, the storm god battles Iluyanka, the serpent. In Greek mythology, Zeus battles Typhon. In Hindu mythology, Indra battles Vritra. The specific names change, the details vary, but the basic pattern repeats. A young god defeats an older chaos monster and thereby establishes cosmic order. Is this because all these cultures influenced each other? Or is it because the pattern speaks to something universal in the human psyche? The eternal struggle between order and chaos, between civilization and wilderness, between the structured world we create and the formless void that always threatens to overwhelm it. Carl Jung would have called this an archetype, a fundamental pattern embedded in the collective unconscious. Joseph Campbell would have included it in his catalogue of universal myths. From this perspective, Marduk is not unique. He is one local manifestation of a story that humanity has told itself in 1,000 different forms across every culture. The combat myth exists because it addresses a fundamental human anxiety. So, we live in a world that can seem chaotic and hostile, where disasters strike without warning, where the forces of nature can destroy everything we build. The storm god who defeats the chaos dragon is a symbolic reassurance. Order can triumph, civilization can prevail, the darkness can be pushed back. But there is something else worth noting. The enuma elish is not just a combat myth. It is also a political charter. It does not merely say that order defeats chaos. It says that this specific god, Marduk, is supreme, that this specific city, Babylon, is the cosmic centre, that this specific political arrangement, with the king subservient to the temple, is divinely ordained. This is what makes the text so powerful and so dangerous. It wraps political claims in theological language. It makes human power structures seem like natural law. It transforms the contingent into the eternal. This is a technique we see used throughout history. When Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, he was not just making a theological choice, he was using Christianity's institutional structure and its theological claim to universal truth to legitimate his rule. When medieval kings claimed to rule by divine right, they were asserting that their authority came not from human consent or military might, but from God's will, making rebellion against the king equivalent to blasphemy. When modern nations declare themselves divinely favoured or speak of manifest destiny, they are using the same rhetorical move. Political power seeks religious legitimation because religious legitimation is the most powerful kind. If your rule is merely practical, it can be challenged on practical grounds. But if your rule is sacred, challenging it becomes heresy. This is what the enuma elish did for Babylon. It made Babylonian supremacy not a political fact but a cosmic truth. Marduk did not just happen to be Babylon's god, he was the creator of the universe. He had defeated chaos itself. All other gods were merely aspects of his supreme divinity. Therefore, Babylon's rule over other cities was not conquest, it was the restoration of proper order. Other nations were not being subjugated. They were being liberated from the chaos of disunity and brought into alignment with cosmic law. Understanding this helps us see why the Jewish exiles in Babylon responded so powerfully to this theology. They were not just homesick, they were facing an existential threat to their identity. If Marduk was supreme, if the enuma elish was true, then Yahweh was at best a minor deity and at worst a fiction. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple could be read as proof that Yahweh had lost his cosmic battle, that he was weaker than Marduk. The Jewish response, as we see it develop in the prophetic literature and in texts like Genesis and 2nd Isaiah, was to assert an even more radical claim. There were no other gods at all. Not because Yahweh had defeated them in battle, but because they had never existed in the first place. The idols of Babylon were just wood and metal. They had no power because they had no being. This was a revolutionary move toward monotheism, and it was forged in the crucible of Babylonian exile, in direct confrontation with the Marduk cult's claims to universal supremacy. The Jews could not match Babylon's military might. They could not rebuild their temple while in captivity, but they could fight back on the level of narrative. They could tell a different story about how the universe worked, and ultimately, their story would prove more durable than Marduk's, because Judaism survived. It adapted. It evolved. It influenced Christianity and Islam. The Jewish God is still worshipped by billions today, but Marduk is dust. What accounts for this difference? Why did one god survive and another perish? The answer is complex, but part of it lies in the relationship between the god and political power. Marduk's supremacy was entirely dependent on Babylon's supremacy. When Babylon fell, Marduk fell with it. His cult required the massive economic and political infrastructure of the temple-palace complex. It required a centralized state that could enforce the collection of tithes. It required literate priests who could read and perform the ancient rituals. When that infrastructure collapsed, the cult could not continue. Judaism, by contrast, had learned to survive without a temple, without a state, without political power. The Babylonian exile had forced this adaptation. Jews learned to worship in synagogues, simple meeting houses that required no elaborate rituals or priestly hierarchies. They learned to focus on Torah study rather than sacrifices. They learned to maintain their identity through practice and belief, rather than through participation in state-sponsored cult. This portability, this adaptability, allowed Judaism to survive the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE and to persist through 2 millennia of diaspora. Marduk was tied to a specific place and a specific political order. When those were destroyed, he could not survive. The Jewish God, by the time of the Second Temple's destruction, had been reimagined as universal, omnipresent, requiring no specific location or political structure. He could be worshipped anywhere by anyone who followed his law. There is a deeper philosophical point here about the nature of divinity and power. Marduk's entire story is about the seizure and maintenance of power. He becomes supreme by defeating chaos, yes, but also by demanding absolute authority as the price for his service. His 50 names are a catalogue of absorbed powers, of conquered and subsumed deities. He is a god built through syncretism and political domination. His mythology is fundamentally about hierarchy, about establishing and maintaining a cosmic pecking order with himself at the top. The Jewish God, as he develops through the prophetic tradition, is different. Power is certainly attributed to him, he's omnipotent, but his relationship with humanity is framed increasingly in terms of covenant, of mutual obligation, of ethical demand rather than raw dominance. The prophets criticize not just Israel's enemies but Israel itself. They claim God values justice and mercy more than sacrifices and rituals. This creates a very different theological dynamic. A God who demands ethical behavior from his worshippers, who can be disappointed in them, who can punish them not for ritual failures but for moral failures, is a God who cannot be easily co-opted by political power, because the ethical standards he represents can be turned against the powerful. The prophets could condemn kings. They could announce that God was not on the side of the nation but against it because of its injustice. This made the Jewish God dangerous to political authority in a way Marduk never was. Marduk legitimated whoever held Babylon. The Jewish God could condemn even his own people. This difference is crucial for understanding why one tradition survived and adapted while the other calcified and died. But we should not be too quick to judge. To the Babylonians, Marduk's theology was not cynical manipulation. It was their honest understanding of how the cosmos worked. They looked at their world, at the unpredictability of floods and droughts, at the constant threat of foreign invasion, at the political chaos of warring city-states, and they created a story that made sense of it all. Chaos was real. They had experienced it. Order was fragile. They had seen it collapse. The triumph of order over chaos could not be taken for granted. It required constant ritual renewal. It required a strong king subservient to divine law. It required everyone knowing their place in the cosmic hierarchy. Their mythology was not false consciousness. It was a genuine attempt to create meaning and stability in an uncertain world. And for 1,000 years, it worked. Babylon thrived under Marduk's protection. Its people found comfort in his worship. Its civilization flourished. We can acknowledge this while also recognizing that the theology served political ends, that it legitimated power structures, that it was as much about human ambition as about divine truth. This brings us back to the central question we have been circling throughout this entire journey. What was Marduk really? Was he a real divine being whose cult gradually grew until he revealed himself as the supreme power? Was he a useful fiction created by priests and kings to consolidate their authority? Was he a symbol, a mythological representation of Babylon itself, the personified ambition of a city that dreamed of ruling the world? Or was he something more subtle, a cultural construct that took on a life of its own, that shaped the people who worshipped him even as they shaped his mythology? Perhaps the answer is that these are not mutually exclusive possibilities. Marduk was all of these things. To the priests who daily tended his statue, he was a real presence, as tangible as any physical being. To the kings who used his cult to legitimize their rule, he was a tool of statecraft. To the common people who watched the akitu processions, he was a symbol of their city's greatness and a source of hope. To the scholars who composed the enuma elish, he was a theological concept, the principle of order made divine. Gods are perhaps always multiple things simultaneously. They are what their worshippers make them, and different worshippers make them into different things. What we can say with certainty is that Marduk was one of the most successful religious innovations in human history. From obscure origins as a minor agricultural deity, he was elevated to become the supreme god of one of the world's most powerful civilizations. His mythology influenced neighbouring cultures and provoked responses that shaped the development of monotheism. His temples were architectural marvels that inspired wonder for thousands of years. His worship employed thousands and generated vast wealth. His rituals created communal meaning for millions of people across more than a millennium. By any measure, Marduk was real in his effects. He shaped history, he changed the world. The fact that his temples are now ruins, that his rituals are no longer performed, that his very name is known only to scholars, does not erase the reality of his historical impact. In the end, perhaps that is what matters. Not whether Marduk truly created the universe from Tiamat's corpse, which he certainly did not, but whether belief in that myth changed how people lived, which it certainly did. Mythology is not the opposite of truth. It is truth of a different kind, a story that shapes reality through the beliefs it inspires and the actions those beliefs produce. The sun sets over the ruins of Babylon. The wind whispers through broken brick, and somewhere, in the silence of the ancient temple grounds, you can almost hear the faint echo of the enuma elish, recited one last time by a priest who knows that his god's reign is ending, that the cosmic order he has devoted his life to maintaining is crumbling, that the story which once seemed eternal is being forgotten when on high the heavens, were not named, and earth below had no name, when only Apsu existed and Tiamat, before the gods were born, before destiny was decreed. Then, says the text, the gods were created. But now, in this twilight moment, as the civilization that birthed them collapses, the gods are decreated. They return to the chaos from which they emerged, and the story begins again, under different names, in different languages, but always the same pattern: the rise, the conquest, the supremacy, and eventually, inevitably, the fall.